Okay, so I'm recording the presentation of the next 3 slides after the webinar itself because unfortunately I had some problems with my audio at the time. So this section is all about Climate Assembly UK itself. And this first slide looks at the basics, so the background of the assembly. It's sort of the premise of the assembly is to look at how the UK should meet its target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So that's the question that's put to the Assembly members, and all of the presentations and all of the discussions and deliberations sort of focus on that as the end goal. It's been launched by 6 parliamentary select committees. It was commissioned in the middle of last year, so middle of 2019. It's taking place in Birmingham over 4 weekends from January to the end of March 2020. And the report, so the recommendations of the Assembly on that question will come out at the end of April 2020. It has 110 members, so that means that 110 people came out of the random selection process, and yeah, this is a group of people, a mini public, who are representative demographically of the UK across 7 characteristics. So that means they represent the UK in terms of their age, their gender, their educational qualification, their ethnicity, where in the UK they live, whether they live in an urban or rural area, and also their attitude to climate change. So that was based on an Ipsos Mori survey, I think conducted last year or relatively recently. So what it means is that the level of concern with regard to climate change at the Assembly is proportionate to the level of concern in the population at large. And it's funded by the House of Commons and 2 foundations, and it's run by Involve UK, which is an organisation that specialises in exactly this kind of event. And they are working on, or they have worked on the design and structure of the Assembly, and they're leading the facilitation. And they're working with 4 expert leads who were appointed by Parliament, and it's their job to ensure balanced information is presented at the Assembly. And there's also another couple of bodies called the advisory panel. So one of them is the sort of advisory panel proper. It's called the advisory panel, and that has about 20 organisations. And the idea is that they represent a cross-section of the political spectrum and have all different kinds of organisations that are represented on there. And there's also an academic panel, which again has, I think, about 20 academics who also advise on the Assembly. So these bodies, they do things like oversee the selection of speakers at the Assembly to ensure that they are presenting a balanced view. Right, so what has been XR's position on Climate Assembly UK so far? Well, our headline criticism is that 2050 is too late. So basically the very premise of this Assembly, this net zero emissions target to which it is working, is flawed. Why is that? Why is 2050 too late? Well, it's an emergency, and you can't take 30 years to deal with an emergency. Secondly, when you look at the global level, getting to net zero by 2050 globally means, according to the current science, 1.5 degrees of warming, and every chance of going past that. So we have to remember that every increment in temperature brings destruction and suffering on a massive scale, and we should be avoiding that at all costs. Okay, even if you were to accept that target at global level, another aspect here is what's known as global equity. So the idea that we should be going faster than other countries, many other countries, anyway. We should be getting to net zero faster because of a historical responsibility. We actually rank 5th highest globally in terms of our emissions. And we also have the capacity to go faster, to get to net zero faster than many other countries. Finally, the target only takes into account emissions produced on our own soil, which is known as production emissions. It doesn't take into account emissions from goods that we import. So when you take all of that into account, that's known as consumption emissions. And yeah, like I say, this target is just about what happens within the UK. So yeah, so that's basically all of that is speaking to that point of why 2050 is too late for a variety of reasons, and that this is you can't take this as read when you start the assembly. This is a really, really key question that participants should be grappling with. Secondly, there's real focus on mitigation. So there is a focus on this first point of how to reduce emissions. That's what I mean by mitigation, and not enough of a focus on biodiversity, and also things like adaptation. So how we actually adapt to the climate emergency, because it's already happening. We can only mitigate so far at this point. And we would be looking for an assembly as XR that would address these things as well. Thirdly, this is a slightly different kind of criticism. So there's no government buy-in to this assembly. This means that the government can basically ignore the recommendations of this assembly. That's because it was set up not by government, which is what we're calling for, but by 6 parliamentary select committees. Now it's their role to scrutinise the role of government. They might launch inquiries on the basis of the recommendations of the assembly. Even that is a little bit up in the air whether the select committees will do that. There's potential doubt there because the select committees themselves are not precisely the same ones that commissioned the assembly in the first place, because we've had a general election. So the makeup of those committees is slightly different to what it was to begin with. So the recommendations are feeding back into a slightly changed body, if you see what I mean, from the one that commissioned it. Even if they do launch inquiries, there's still several hurdles before the government would actually implement anything. So that's a real question mark here. But of course, so there's quite a lot of criticisms there. Of course, we support the assembly as a process. So we love citizens' assemblies. It's our third demand, and it's really what XR is all about. So this assembly does look like a really, really well run one on its own terms. It's just that the terms, the framework within which it is working, is flawed. And yeah, as for XR's response so far to Climate Assembly UK, we have had some meetings with the organisers as part of their outreach to different kinds of organisations, basically during which we developed the position that I just outlined, or on the back of which we developed that position, which we then put into an internal brief, which we produced along with several other working groups, and XR Birmingham, XR Wales, XR Scotland. And I'm going to distribute that after the webinar. And we've also done some press around this, some statements in various newspapers, and an appearance on Sky News. We've also, several of us in our working group and others have observed the assembly in person in Birmingham. We co-signed a letter that appeared in The Guardian towards the end of February, so a few days ago. And that's basically, so that letter, we co-signed it with a number of MPs and scientists and a couple of other environmental organisations, and it just basically sets out the points that I made on the previous slide about 2050, or some of those points about why 2050 is too late and why that means that the Climate Assembly UK is flawed in terms of its setup. We have also produced an animation coming out soon, And there'll be a panel in Birmingham organised by XR Birmingham, which will be parallel to the fourth weekend of Climate Assembly UK, but at a different place. So it's very much separate to Climate Assembly UK, but it's addressing some of the themes and has a similar premise essentially to this webinar in terms of like looking at the pros and cons and creating a discussion around Climate Assembly UK and using it as a platform to talk about deliberative democracy and promote it.